Good morning, everyone. I believe that we have most people have joined the Zoom, so welcome. If you don't know me, my name is Elizabeth Darling, and I'm the manager of membership and annual giving here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And this is our latest edition of our member-only virtual program, Curator Conversations. And before we get into the program, I did just want to give a few housekeeping items. We are going to have the closed captioning. The ticker tape is going to be available at the bottom of your screen if you would like it. If you do want to remove it, let us know in the chat and we can show you how to remove that function. If you don't need the closed captioning and if you find it distracting from the program, we can walk you through how to turn that off in the chat. We will be talking with our curatorial team, discussing some exciting donations that we have received throughout the past year and how they relate to our larger connection and the sometimes really interesting connections they have to Virginia history. If you do have questions throughout the chat, we'd love to have them. You can add them to the Q&A, or you can add them to the chat function, and we will take those questions at the end of the program. And I believe that those are all of the housekeeping items. Lastly, of course, if you are having any technical difficulties, just put that in the chat, and our tech guru, Haley Fenner, and I will attempt to sort those out for you. I think without further ado, we will go ahead and get started. So again, welcome, and I'm going to pass it off to our curatorial team.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. So for those who don't know me, my name is Andy Talkov. You can go to the next slide. And I am the Senior Director of Curatorial Affairs here at the museum. And one of the responsibilities that our curatorial staff has is to oversee the addition of what turns out to be hundreds of new objects in the 8 million object VMHC collection, or nearly 9 million actually. And some of these items are identified, internally or are brought to our attention and are purchased, but the vast majority of the objects that we add every year are pieces from your own collections or collections that have been part of people's family history that they offer to us. So today I'm joined by my colleagues, Dr. Karen Sherry, our senior curator, our curator, Paige Newman, and I'm very excited that we're also joined by our John R. Nelson curatorial intern, Lauren Bach, who are going to talk about some of the favorite things that they've worked with this past year and brought into our collection. So you'll meet Karen, Paige, and Lauren in a few minutes, but I thought I would jump right in with an exciting donation that we received that helps to tell the story of Virginia's indigenous people. So you can go to the next slide. So Virginia's indigenous people began making pottery out of local clay, dug primarily around Virginia's rivers more than 3,000 years ago. These vessels were produced in various shapes and sizes and used for cooking, like the one that's shown here in this late 1500s illustration after John White, but they were also used for storage and other purposes. You can go to the next slide. Here are two examples of pre-contact vessels that were found in King William County, which is today home to the Pamunkey Indian Reservation. The pottery that was being made was largely produced by forming coils of clay that were laid on top of one another and then smoothed with paddles or by hand to create flat surfaces. And as you can see in these examples, the outside surfaces were often textured by cord or fabric or net impressions, or had stamped or incised designs. And in fact, because cord and fabric don't survive, these pieces of pottery also give us a sense of Virginia Indian textiles as well. And then to these clays, sometimes crushed shell or sand or rock would be mixed together to improve strength in drying and firing. So if we go to the next slide, by the mid 1700s, certainly after European contact, members of the Pamunkey Indian tribe were making plates and cups and chamber pots and jars, not only for themselves, but also for sale to the nearby English communities. These items show a transformation from the traditional forms that you saw earlier to more to show more European design influence. These types of pieces, this jar and plate, are often referred to as Colono Indian ware, which was a term that was coined by archaeologists in the 1960s. So they did not refer to them in this way, but this is how they're classified today. By the 1800s, though, railroads were bringing cheap, mass-produced kitchenwares into Virginia, and the demand for Pamunkey handmade pottery had significantly decreased. And the craft was nearly extinct by the early 1900s, and it was being maintained by a very small number of people in that community. If you go to the next slide, and then came the Great Depression. And at the time, many members of the Pamunkey Indian tribe were dependent on hunting and fishing and farming to make a living. But in an effort to try to sustain the tribe, the Commonwealth of Virginia proposed the idea of fostering arts and crafts in their community by reinitiating the creating of pottery, but this time not for function and home use, but for sale as souvenirs and for a tourist industry. So the government established the Pamunkey Pottery School with the permission of the tribe in 1932. And the state would provide materials for the building to house the pottery school, and they would also provide non-Indigenous instructors who introduced a number of new techniques to the traditional techniques that had been used by the Pamunkey. So here in this image, you see at far left, Mary Alberta Page, Ruth Bradby Cook is in the center, and Daisy Stewart Bradby is at the far right. This was taken about 1940 and shows these three women at work at the Pamunkey Pottery School. So if you go to the next slide, we were very pleased to add this example of a ceramic bowl to our collection this past year. And one of the things I'll mention about the Pottery School is that once the school was founded, the Pamunkey Pottery Guild was organized by the women of the tribe, and it was a cooperative that coordinated the production as well as the market for this type of pottery. The guild purchased supplies, set standard prices, and there were a number of innovations that had been introduced or new techniques, including things that would speed production, like potter's wheels and molds, as well as firing in kilns. And so if you go to the next slide, here's another view of Mary Bradby's, one of Mary Bradby's many ceramic bowls. And you can see that there are a number of there's a significant sort of pictographic southwestern motif that was applied. And in part, this was because in the mid 20th century and even before, like a lot of sense of Indianness was associated with southwestern Indians. And so these painting techniques were adopted as part of this tourist industry or tourist craft industry, even though this wasn't a traditional form of decoration for Pamunkey pottery. But these designs did give Pamunkey potters an opportunity to tell stories of their people. And if you go to the next slide, Ms. Bradby also produced other shaped vessels, and she and many others would paint other motifs, like animal motifs that were were particular to their history. So an eagle motif, or there were a lot of aquatic motifs, given the Pamunkeys' connection to the water. And in addition to vases and bowls, there were, effigy pipes and plates and ashtrays and salt and pepper shakers that all make up this sort of Pamunkey pottery school craft tradition. So if you go to the next slide, in the late 20th century, there was a movement. So this industry helped the tribe survive. But in the late 20th century, there was a movement to return to indigenous craft traditions. And so in this example on the left, that's from the National Museum of the American Indian that was made by Daisy Stewart Bradley, you can see a much more traditional style here that piece was made in 1980. And then today, Pamunkey potters and pottery are still very active. One of the forms that they produce is this blackware, which you can see on the right, which is highly polished and glazed. We are really very excited to be able to include Ms. Bradby's ceramic vessel in the VMHC collection. There were no other examples of that in our collection before this year. And I think that not only is pottery significant in telling this story because it embodies the shared past and the place and experiences of Virginia's indigenous people, but it also tells this amazing story of transformation, a market economy, and the continuity, but development of Pamunkey pottery traditions. And so we're really grateful for this donation, and I'm also grateful to Dr. Ashley Atkins Spivey, who has done a lot of research on this topic. And certainly if you're interested, you can find some of her writing on this topic online. Now that, so moving on, we'll look at another art tradition that was added to our collection this year, and I'll introduce Dr. Karen Sherry.
Thanks, Andy, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, I'm going to talk about this really interesting portrait we brought into the collection. If I could have the next slide, please. A portrait of the Marquis de Lafayette, a very famous figure in both French and American history. He was as many of you probably know, he was a French aristocrat who came to fight in the American Revolution, in part out of a shared commitment to the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality. He became very close to George Washington and worked under him. He commanded troops in Virginia. including at the decisive Battle of Yorktown, which led to America's victory. And for that reason, the Marquis de Lafayette became a beloved figure among Americans. So this is a portrait of him. And what's really interesting about this portrait, if I could have the next slide, please, is its medium, its technique. It's reverse painting on glass. And as that phrase suggests, it's a portrait painted on glass, but it's painted in the reverse of how you would typically paint an oil portrait. You're painting an oil portrait of somebody. You start with the dark colors, the background layers, and you build up to the highlights. In reverse glass painting, you do the reverse. You work backwards. You lay down the bright highlights first, and then add the additional layers behind it. So it's difficult to tell from the slide, although I included a detail which I hope gives you some sense of how all the painting is on the back side of the glass. If you were to be standing in front of this portrait, you would see the glossy surface of a piece of glass and all the paint and the gilding that makes up Lafayette's epaulettes. Those would all be behind the glass because they're painted on the reverse side. So this technique, it's a kind of a long-standing folk tradition in Western art that not just some professional artists, but also amateurs practiced. If I could have the next slide, please. This portrait was most likely, if not definitely, based on a print source, and perhaps even the very print I'm showing on the screen. In the age before not just our digital technologies, but before photography, which is invented in the late 1830s, prints were really the only mass-produced medium, and therefore also the most readily available medium because, relatively speaking, they were affordable and they could be produced in multiples. So prints were the primary way of disseminating visual information in the pre-photographic era. So the artist who made this glass portrait was likely working from a print such as the one shown. If I could have the next picture, please. And images of Lafayette in printed form and other media really proliferated because he was so beloved among American audiences. There are lots of images from his heroics in the American Revolution, but also from his 1824 to 25 visit to the United States. He came back to the US after the Revolutionary War at the invitation of President James Monroe, and Lafayette toured all of what were then the 24 states of the Union, and he was greeted with great fanfare wherever he went. As you can see from some of these other images inspired by his 1824-25 visit to the States, our portrait, the glass portrait, likely dates from around the time of Lafayette's visit. If I could have the next image. And what I find also particularly interesting about this portrait is that it may have been made in China, specifically for an American market. And we have other examples of this. We know of several other reverse glass painted portraits of Lafayette. You can see one example on the right. Given the misspelling of General and Lafayette, it suggests maybe someone who is not fluent in English painted this. Also, we know that American merchants regularly sent popular prints over to China for the production of reverse glass wares, ceramic wares, and other materials that would then be imported to the States and marketed to American audiences. In Chinese art, there's a long tradition of reverse glass painting, and so there are many skilled artisans in this technique. And our Lafayette portrait, even though it has a kind of almost folksy style with its very flattened linear forms, if you look at the subtleties of the painting, it's very, very skillfully done, which leads me to suspect that there's a possibility it was made in China. And just another example of this phenomenon, if I could have the next slide, please. Another popular print from the early national period, which was designed by the artist Edward Savage. It's the print shown on the left of the goddess Liberty, feeding, giving succor to the American eagle. This became a hugely popular print. It's one of these prints that was sent to China for production as a reverse glass painting. I could have the next slide, please. In addition to being painted on glass, schoolgirls at female academies around the new nation regularly use this print in making embroideries and other works of art. So if I could have the next slide. This reverse glass painting, it not only allows us to represent the hero of Yorktown in the American Revolution, a great French friend to the American people and his popularity among American audiences, but it also allows us to tell the story a little bit about the proliferation and production of images in the early national period. If I could have one more slide. And it joins our collection, which has other images of Lafayette at various phases of his career. But this will be the first reverse glass painting. So I'm very grateful to add this to the collection. And so with that, I am going to pass the baton, so to speak, on to our John R. Nelson curatorial intern, Lauren Bach. Lauren, take it away.
Thank you, Karen. I got to work with the Floral Curator collection during my time as an intern this semester. And if I could get the next slide, please. Curator was a well-known Virginia state political activist and feminist. Her politics focused mainly on feminist causes and getting the Equal Rights Amendment passed in Virginia. She first became involved in the Democratic Party in Fairfax in the 1940s, and as time progressed, she became more and more personally involved. She ran for a few elected office positions over time, such as lieutenant governor, U.S. Senate, and the House of Delegates, but she ultimately reigned unsuccessful. So this first slide here is a reference to her work with the ERA. This photo was taken in 1978 at the Democratic Convention in Virginia, and she is holding the flower here that is shown on the right. It's kind of hard to tell, but it was pink and it is made out of tissue paper. She and other women who were also feminist and political activists, sometimes referred to as Curator's Raiders, would pass out these flowers while they lobbied, usually at US Congress, to get the ERA passed. The pink was to symbolize the female vote and its importance, and the flower was a play on Flora's name. If I could get the next slide, please. She was very well known for her work during the second wave of feminism, which focused specifically on sexism in American society. On the left, we have a picture of a Susan B. Anthony necklace, which she is photographed in a lot. And Susan B. Anthony was a large figure during the first wave of feminism and was a big inspiration to Flora. And on the right, we have a button for the ERA. Flora lobbied a lot in 1978, particularly because in 1979 was the limit on getting the ERA passed for state ratification, but the Supreme Court actually had to push it to 1982. But it was not passed in Virginia until 2020, 11 years after her death. If I could get the next slide, please. So on this slide, on the picture on the left is a button for her campaign for lieutenant governor. She ran as independent, and while she did lose, she actually got 10.5% of the vote, which is quite a lot for a third-party candidate. And on it, you can see a flower, which refers to the flower that we saw earlier. And again, it's a play on her name. And then on the right is a button for the National Organization for Women. She founded the first chapter in Virginia in 1970. And on the top is a quote, part of a quote from Susan B. Anthony that says, "Never another season of silence." And then in the following year, she would actually become head of the National Women's Political Caucus, further signifying her personal involvement in politics and particularly women's causes. If I could get the next slide, please. And then these buttons kind of go over some of the causes of second wave feminism that I mentioned. On the left, we have a Planned Parenthood button. Flora was a big advocate for getting Roe v. Wade passed, which it did, but eventually it has been overturned. And the second button refers to VMI. Up until 96, the college did not let any female students in. On it says, if we can go to Saudi Arabia, we can go to VMI, which is a reference to the 1990 and 1991 Gulf War. Equal education opportunities was a big proponent, and getting women involved in education was important for they were able to fight, but they couldn't get educated as equally as their male counterpoints. So it actually became a Supreme Court case. And in 96 was when the Supreme Court ruled against VMI, which thus made them start allowing women to enter. But only one female student did enter into the school in 96, and she didn't actually graduate. But in the next year or two, about 30 plus students were able to become part of VMI, and they did graduate with their classes. And then on the right here, we have a pay fair, pay equity. Where's my 29 cents button? This pin came from the National Committee on Pay Equity. Again, another big feminist cause that Flora was very involved in. I think this collection shows to be really important, for it not only fills a gap in the museum's collection with second wave feminism, but also emphasizes Virginia state politics and US politics and how it counteracts with women's history throughout time. So with that, I will pass it on to Paige Newman.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for joining us today. So we're going to talk about John Dabney and the Dabney Cup. So 19th century chef and caterer John Dabney was awarded this trophy cup in 1860 with the inscription, "Complimentary to John Dabney from the citizens of Richmond, Virginia, champion julep." Dabney achieved much success as a chief and restaurateur in Richmond, especially his elaborate mint juleps, described as hailstorm juleps. Ice was shipped in large blocks at this time, which had to be broken apart, and Dabney's tool of choice for breaking up the ice was a carpenter's plane, which he shaved the ice for his juleps. One account describes a giant multi-serving silver cup topped with a 1 foot tall pyramid of ice encrusted sides, and a cornucopia of fruits sticking to the ice in stunning artistic designs. Dabney never wrote his recipe down, but he did. He taught his son, and his son, and I quote, said, "Crushed ice, as much as you can pack in, and sugar, mint bruised and put in with the ice, then your good brandy, and the top surmounted by more mint, a strawberry, a cherry, a slice of pineapple, or any other fixing as you like." On the right is a recipe for a mint julep from one of our books in our collection, just to give you an idea. So it's somewhat similar to what Dabney would create, and according to the description I just read. So next slide, please. Dabney was born enslaved in 1864. His success allowed him to accrue enough money to purchase freedom for himself and his wife, Elizabeth. He became head of the kitchen and bar at the Exchange Hotel and Ballard House in downtown Richmond. And Dabney and Elizabeth opened their own successful catering business and restaurant. And the image shows it's sort of in the foreground. This, you can see the sign, John Dabney's Restaurant and Furnishing House, a sign that hung on the wall in their restaurant, advised patrons to, and I quote, "Call softly, pay promptly, drink moderately, part friendly, and call again." Dabney continued to work up to a week before his death. He passed away on June 7th, 1900, at the age of 76. Next slide, please. So we received the trophy cup from a descendant of Dabney by marriage. This man holding the cup is Neville Featherstone. And in addition to the cup, we received this newspaper clipping, which there isn't a lot about Dabney, but with this newspaper clipping, and shows his son, who was John Milton Dabney, who's the youngest son of John and Elizabeth. And it shows him standing with the trophy cup and the 6 metal straws. That we didn't receive any straws with the trophy cup, but my understanding is that this is how people would enjoy Dabney's Hailstorm julep, because that thing is pretty big, if you could tell. The trophy cup is currently on exhibit here at the VMHC in the Cheers exhibit, which is open till February 9th, 2023. So I hope you would come, swing by, take a look at the trophy cup, and just visit us. So thank you. With that, I am going to pass it to Andy.
Thanks, Paige. So in this segment that I'll call Litter Bearers, hopefully you'll be able to see the remarkable connection that we came to find out about as a result of a lecture that we did in partnership with the MCV Foundation. So we can go to the next slide. So the lecture that we did with the MCV Foundation focused on combat medicine and the incredible advances in combat medicine that were the result of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And uncontrolled bleeding is one of the leading causes of death on the battlefield, but even at home, it's the second leading cause of death in civilian trauma settings. So there's been a lot of effort over time to find the most effective ways to stop the flow of blood. And oftentimes this included pressure or the use of a tourniquet. But of course, a tourniquet is only useful in the extremities and certainly not in many instances. So as a result of this lecture, we were really surprised to learn that there was a very Virginia-centered connection between this and, if you go to the next slide, this. So any of you have cats know that over over the last few decades, one of the great advances in kitty litter has been the fact that you can get clumping kitty litter that will make it easier to clean out your cat box. This was noticed, if you go to the next slide, by an MCV professor named Robert Diegelman, who you can see here at right. And in 2005, Bob was in advance of a holiday gathering at their home, was asked by his wife to go and make sure that the litter boxes were clean. Now, Dr. Diegelman had been working at VCU and MCV since 1972, and he helped establish their tissue repair lab and in the division of plastic surgery. And so as he began cleaning out the cat box, he was wondering what it was about the clumping characteristics of the kitty litter that might be able to be applied to the coagulation of blood. So he, the next day, he called a colleague and went into the lab, and as we're told, was using his own blood to test the cat litter and what the effect of the cat litter and the chemical that was in there, which they learned was called sodium bentonite, which is a natural sealant and causes that clumping action, how that might be able to be applied to stem the flow of blood. So over the course of the early studies, one of the things that they needed to do was figure out how fine the sodium bentonite needed to be. So among the items, so at this program, Bob was at the program, and having heard this story, we immediately approached him and asked if he would be interested in sharing his story with the museum and future generations, as this was a pretty significant discovery that occurred right here in Richmond. One of the things he brought to us is this wife's coffee grinder that he used to grind the sodium bentonite in various finenesses in order to figure out which one would be the most effective. Ultimately, he took this, onto the lab. And you can see him here mixing a compound that would become known as called Woundstat. So if you go to the next slide, Woundstat was developed in the 2010s. By 2008, the Department of Defense had recommended that soldiers in all branches of the service carry this. And what Woundstat was a powder that could be poured and packed directly into a wound to stem the flow of bleeding. So Woundstat was used for a time by the military, but was replaced, if you go to the next slide, by something that you can buy on Amazon today. This is called Clot, and instead of being a powder, it's actually the compound is impregnated into gauze pads that can be packed into wounds to stem the flow of blood. So combat gauze is used by all branches of the military. It's used in civilian applications and has really revolutionized wound care in the United States and even, across the world. So if you're, interested, you can go online and get some Clot, to help you the next time you have a wound that won't stop bleeding. I'll mention that the Clot uses a compound that includes kaolin, which is like a fine white clay. And then a more recent and new application, if you go to the next slide, the compound that Bob and his colleagues developed is also being used in a device called hemospray, which can actually be applied to internal gastrointestinal bleeding. So this is a product that's also available through Cook Medical, that's allowed for internal bleeding to be stemmed as well using the same compound. So Dr. Diegelman, if you go to the next slide, patented this compound in 2017 and very recently donated the original patent document to the VMHC collection, along with these examples of the products that were the result of his research to us. In 2018, he was awarded the Billy R. Martin Innovation Award from Virginia Commonwealth University. He's quite accomplished and holds 4 US and 3 foreign patents and has published 200 scientific articles and books and chapters in books. So I think this is a great example of sometimes the accidental ways that we find out about amazing parts of Virginia's story. And we're really grateful to Bob Diegelman and Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Ward, who also helped develop this compound, for being so generous, not only with these items that will help tell this story in the future, but for helping to share their stories. And it's very exciting when we get to meet the history makers, in person, since a lot of the people that we deal with on a daily basis have passed, and we don't really get to talk to them. And I'm sure that you'll see Dr. Diegelman in future programs, as we continue our relationship with him, and to tell this story of this amazing development that happened just down the road. So now we'll go back to Paige to talk about Fred and Frances Bateman.
Thanks, Andy. So we're going to talk about the Bateman collection. Fred and Frances. So we'll start with Fred. Fred Bateman was a Virginia State Senator, Circuit Court Judge, and President of the Virginia State Bar. He served as a line officer in the Navy from 1942 to 1946, and remained in the Naval Reserve as a legal officer, and retired as a commander. After service in World War II, he and his wife Frances moved to Newport News in 1952, when he began practicing law with Thomas Downing and became active in political life. Next slide, please. So he managed Downing's first campaign for Congress, and then he himself was elected as state senator in 1959 for 2 terms before being defeated by Herbert H. Bateman. You see the photograph of Stone and Bateman and Campbell taking the oath of office, and then the pamphlet to re-elect Bateman, since he didn't work. But a fun fact about Bateman is he sponsored legislation which named the American foxhound as the official dog of Virginia in 1966. And you can see that cute photo of Mouse, American foxhound. Next slide, please. In 1981, Bateman was elected to be a judge in Newport News Circuit Court. And he retired at the age of 72, but continued to serve as a substitute judge for many years. So let's move on to Frances. Here's Frances. She graduated from Loyola University, majoring in English and philosophy. She became a registered nurse, graduating from St. Elizabeth Hospital in Chicago, Illinois in 1936, where she served as Assistant Director of Nurses Training. At the outbreak of World War II, she volunteered for the Navy and was appointed an ensign of the Nurse Corps, the U.S. Naval Reserve, in 1943. She was commissioned as an officer and assigned as an instructor in the Navy Corps School in San Diego, California, where she taught Navy and Marine corpsmen. This is where Frances and Fred met. And at this time, when they met, she actually outranked him. So we can move on to the next slide. So she also was one of the pioneer flight attendants employed by TWA. And at the time, when being a nurse was a requirement for the job. And the hostess, that is a pamphlet, just if you want to become a hostess. And interior just gives information. And the first requirement says you need at least 3 years, minimum of 3 years training at an accredited hospital. Here's another image of Frances. When they moved to Newport News, they actually had one son, Stuart, who donated this collection to us. Frances continued to be active in Newport News community, especially with Fred's political career. And she also had a passion for art. So an art scholarship in her name was established at Virginia Wesleyan University in Virginia Beach after her death in 1978. There wasn't much about Frances in this collection, unfortunately, more about Fred and his career, but I just love some of these images. I wish I could show you more, but hopefully we'll get this process soon and you can come look at it in our library. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Karen.
All right, thank you, Paige. For our final featured new acquisition, I'm going to talk to you about a pretty extraordinary piece of furniture. If I could have the next slide, please. Now, I should preface this by saying we very rarely acquire furniture for our collection. We, in part because Virginia furniture is already well represented in our collection, and in part for various logistical reasons. It's big, it's difficult to store, and we have limited, space limitations both in storage and in exhibitions. But we were really delighted to bring this piece into the collection because of its many extraordinary features. This is a desk that is made of walnut as the primary wood, yellow pine as a secondary or interior woods, made by a Scottish-born furniture maker named John Shearer. Shearer immigrated to Virginia in 1775, and he worked here through the remainder of his career. His last dated piece is 1818, so he died sometime after 1818. He worked primarily in the northern section of Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, which back in the late 18th and 19th century was backcountry Virginia. Shearer worked in Loudoun County and Berkeley County, the latter of which is now in West Virginia. He also had a very short stint in Frederick County in Maryland. So this is one of his mature pieces made in 1817. And one of the reasons, one of the many reasons we were so excited to bring this into the collection is that this really represents an example of the best skilled furniture maker working in that region in this period. For the most part, settlers living in that portion of Virginia did not have access to fine furnishings such as this unless they imported them from other major cultural centers like Alexandria or Philadelphia and so forth. So Shearer was really one of the few and one of the best furniture makers active in that region in that period. And he's not already represented in our collection, so this helps us deepen our holdings of that craft. This is a fall front desk, so the slant top unfolds to show a whole series of compartments on the interior above the writing surface. I could have the next slide, which just shows some detail, so you can see his craftsmanship. If you could go back one slide, please, Haley. One thing I forgot to, oh, sorry, not back, forward one slide. A couple of the features that Shearer is known for show some kind of eccentricities of his practice. He was known for not just his skill, but for combining certain Baroque furniture styles with neoclassical motifs. And the Baroque features you can see in that kind of serpentine shape of the desk's body, the swelling ogee feet. So for your furniture connoisseurs out there, you might recognize those as Baroque furniture styles. But then Shearer combined them with neoclassical motifs, and he incorporated pretty elaborate inlay into a lot of his works, including this desk. You can see on the fall board, there's a cartouche with an inscription that then is flanked by two anchors. Many of these inlaid pieces in Shearer's work speak to his British identity, his British pride, and also reference the Britain's involvement in the Napoleonic Wars. So you see, and naval victories. So you see a lot of references to the Royal Navy in the form of the anchors on our piece. I'll show you some others in just a moment, but the inscription at the center of the fall board, it identifies the patron and Shearer's name. And this inscription reads, "Made for Alfred and Mrs. Charlotte Belt by native North Britain, and then it gives the date. That folks from Scotland were referred to as North Britons in this era. So Shearer is very kind of emphatically identifying his Scottish heritage in that way. And if I could have the next slide, please. Here's an example of a chest of drawers at Colonial Williamsburg, where you see more of those motifs, which are kind of a regular feature of Shearer's works. The British regal lion, the lion rampant with a crown, and an inscription talking about Britannia rules, and then also an inlaid signature by Shearer along with a thistle that's a symbol of Scotland. So it is, and I want to underscore, it's pretty unusual in this period to have furniture makers sign their works at all. Also, it's pretty unusual in America to have a craftsman of any kind so emphatically declaring British sensibilities. Those are some of the features that make this work unique. If I could have the next slide, please. Shearer also wrote his name on the interior of this desk more than 14 times. And as I mentioned, it's pretty rare for furniture makers to sign their works at all. We have multiple signatures on this desk. And scholars posit two reasons for that. One is that he was kind of vain and just loved to mark his name on things. And perhaps there's a bit of truth in that, but I think one explanation that's probably more likely is that for as talented as Shearer was as a furniture maker, he seemed to lead a pretty hard scrabble existence. And it seems that he never owned his own shop. He probably rented space in other woodworking shops or buildings. And so the proliferation of signatures on boards was his way of identifying his wood that he would be storing in someone else's workshop. But whatever the reason, it's pretty extraordinary to have signed works of furniture from this period. All that said, the most unique and I think fabulous aspects of this work, if I could have the next slide, please, is that this desk contains a hidden message. Now, we haven't been able to fully access the message yet. We know of it from when this desk was photographed and examined for auction back in the 90s. We're in the process of kind of accumulating some funds to bring a furniture conservator to help us fully access this message. But if you look at the body of the desk, the interior of the desk, you'll see in the left-hand slide, it's highlighted with the red circle. There are these little pilasters. Behind the pilasters, there's an empty compartment where the tambour door, and the door is just to the right of the that highlighted area. It's in a kind of an accordion style door that slides open to reveal additional doors behind it. And in the slide on the left, the slide on the right, the highlighted area, that's an empty little compartment in which that door slides when you open that door to access the additional drawers. Next slide, please. Now, Shearer wrote a note on a piece of paper and pasted it to the inside wall of that empty compartment. And you can sort of see, the hint of some writing in that mirror. We took a photograph with a mirror. And this note is kind of Shearer sort of giving it to the man, Shearer complaining about his patron. He says, "I am John Shearer Joyner," Joyner was another word for furniture maker, "from Edinburgh, that made this desk for Alfred Belt, the meanest known man. I worked for the greatest scoundrel in Loudoun County." And then there's another inscription. "He was hated by his neighbors and loved by nobody." So this is pretty extraordinary to have this hidden message bashing his patron. Now, we don't have any documents about why Shearer hated his patrons so much. We don't know the source of his animosity towards Alfred Belt. Belt, he was a wealthy planter and doctor whose estate Rock Hill was located in Loudoun County. We know that he was an enslaver of more than 18 individuals, but we don't really know anything else about him or his character or why Shearer felt the need to leave this nasty note. But it's a pretty extraordinary aspect of this desk. And once we are able to hire a furniture conservator, we can share that with you, I'm sure, in various ways. We'll kind of take apart the interior of this desk so we can fully access that message and make sure it gets documented and preserved. I'm going to skip my final slides so that we can turn it over to you all for questions and comments.
Thanks so much, Karen, and to the rest of the curators. I definitely learned some things as well. I'm thinking of that message, that hidden message, and there is some parallels to comments on YouTube or wherever these days. Making your voice heard wherever you can. Well, yes, so we are at the Q&A section of the program. If you have questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A section or to the chat. I will throw one out there to kick us off, and this is for Andy or for any of the curators. How does the VMHC decide what artifacts that they will collect, and what's the process for if I have an object that I'm interested in perhaps donating, what's the process for getting that object donated potentially to the museum?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first step in making an offer for the donation of an object, our preferred method is that you go online to our website and there's a form called the donor offer form. If you fill that out, it will not only give us some information about you, but it will also prompt you for some questions about the item itself, its size, what its connection to Virginia history is, how you came, to own this object. And that's very helpful. Those forms, when they're submitted, come to me. And then based on what the object or collection is, one of the curators will be assigned to follow up. And at that point, the curators will do some additional research about the object and present it to our acquisitions committee, which meets every month. It's made up of collections managers and conservators and curators who all review every offer that's given to us and assess it based on whether the museum, whether that type of object isn't represented in the museum's collection, the strength of its connection to Virginia's story. As Karen said, sometimes there are just logistical concerns like condition that we need to, be careful about, as well as our ability to store it and maintain it, well into the future. I mean, we're in the forever business, so we want to accept things that we can care for, well into the future. And at that point, the group will decide whether to accept an offer, or oftentimes, if we can't accept the offer, we'll suggest another institution or organization that might be interested in that piece for their collection. So it's a process that takes some time. I mean, it can take as many as 3 months for us to fully assess a piece and then be able to get back to someone. So, but we welcome offers. I mean, that's how our collection has been built, is by people offering us pieces of history that they want to share, you know, for the future.
Great, thank you. And I have also included the link to that webpage in our chat for anyone that wants the nuts and bolts of what Andy went over. There's a lot of information on our website about that. Another question is, let me see if I can find it here. For the objects, the objects and items that were mentioned in this program, Paige, I know you mentioned that the Dabney Cup is on display in our Cheers Virginia exhibition. How many of the objects that were mentioned in this program are available for view either in exhibitions or to make an appointment to come view in the collection in the library? So I have a feeling not all are immediately available on display.
With manuscripts, they can be. Even if it's unprocessed, we do survey the collection, so we have an idea and the library knows. We just like a heads up if anyone wants to see anything, but it is available to view.
Yeah, I think, and my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, but very few of these items are currently on view, just as it takes us time to process the collection. It takes us time to organize exhibitions, to turn over displays in existing exhibitions. Some of you may have learned about Curator. She was featured in the Agents of Change exhibition that we did to commemorate the centennial of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote in this country in 2020. And that's actually the donation of this large collection of Curator materials came out of our working with Curator's family for that exhibition. Other pieces will, you know, as time goes by and we're able to rotate some of our new installations, such as our Commonwealth and other exhibitions, we'll do our best to rotate some of these pieces into our displays. But as part of our processing, we do also try to get them out on the website in our online catalog, so folks will also get to see them there. For my colleagues, did I miss anything in that?
I think we got some agreement there. Well, I do want to honor our time since we are at the hour mark. I did, for our members who are on the call, I did want to let you know that our next curator conversation is going to be in February of 2023. I'm having a hard time believing that December is now and that next month is going to be 2023, but it will be February 27th, 2023 at 10 a.m. And we will be discussing our very exciting upcoming traveling show that's coming here in March. So you're going to get a sneak peek of the Smithsonian's traveling exhibition Apollo when we went to the moon. So we're going to have an out of this world experience on that program, pardon the pun. I would also recommend that our members check out our calendar of events on our website. We have a lot of upcoming programming, both virtually and in person. We have member-only tours of American Democracy with the illustrious Andy Talkoff. The next one will be this Thursday, December 8th at 10:30 a.m. And then the final one will be next Thursday, which is December 15th at 10:30 a.m. as well. So those are free and only for members. So make sure that you register for those. And again, a hearty thank you to all of our curators for taking the time this morning to give us a roundup of highlights of acquisitions for the year. And for all of our members who are on the call, thank you so much for your continued support. We certainly could not do what we do here at the museum without your support. And if we don't see you around before the new year, have a very happy holiday season and Happy New Year. We'll see you at the museum soon. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.